The SS Harriet B. Today's particular vessel came in with several different names, along with several different purposes, all on the Great Lakes. Originally named the Shenango No. 2, this vessel was built in 1895 in Toledo, Ohio by Craig Shipbuilding. The Shenango was built for the United States and Ontario Steam Navigation Company of Conneaut, Ohio. This was a subsidiary of Pittsburgh, Shenango, and Lake Erie Railway Company. The Shenango had an overall good length of 300 feet, and she actually ranked up there pretty high with other vessels, being the largest wooden ships ever built. The Shenango had a beam of 53 feet and a hull of 19.33 feet. She had a gross tonnage of 1,938 tons and a net tonnage of 1,317. She was also powered by two 1,250 horsepower fore and aft compound steam engines. The Shenango was launched on October 25, 1895. In 1898, the Shenango was sold to the Detroit and Grand Rapids Western Railroad Company of Muskegon, Michigan. She then received her first renaming to the Muskegon. In 1901, the Muskegon was sold to the Pere Marquette Railroad Company, and then she was renamed again to Pere Marquette 16. And finally, in 1918, the Pere Marquette 16 was sold to her last company, the Hammer Mill Paper Company of Erie, Pennsylvania. She was then cut down to be a bulk freighter for use in the pulpwood trade across the Great Lakes, and this is where she received her last and final name, the Harriet B. In 1921, the Harriet B was then reduced to be a barge on the Great Lakes. In December of 1901, lightkeeper Adam N. Weckler had been at his post for about 16 months, since August 14th of 1900. The Pere Marquette Harbor Life-Saving Station had been established in 1871. Adam had trained his crew and other volunteers. This training was soon to make the difference between life and death for 33 members on the Pere Marquette 16. Adam and his life-saving crew at Ludington, Michigan had been discharged for the winter. This was in December of 1901. Some of the men and volunteers were as named here: Bernd Carlson, William D. Young, George Robinson, Peter Carlson, Levi Schroeder, Oscar Wilkinson, and John Nelson. The captain at the time for the Pere Marquette 16 was Captain George L. Thompson. He had once again skillfully and successfully guided his vessel across Lake Michigan from Milwaukee. This was with the assistance as well of his officers and crew. A.T. Doherty served as his mate, S. Brunel, second mate, Ernest Heedle, pursuer, Samuel Sylvester, chief engineer, and George Van Brunt, assistant engineer. The Pere Marquette 16 carried a full load of cargo, this being some 26 loaded cars, and 10 of them were filled with perishable goods that were valued at around $12,000. The ship itself was also valued at around $165,000. Captain Thompson, his officers, and crew departed for the day. They headed for Ludington, Michigan. The wind speeds began to grow until they reached around 40 miles an hour, and what followed you can probably guess: towering waves. Captain Thompson was definitely not inexperienced in his sailing years. As the Pere Marquette 16 approached her destination of the Ludington Piers, Captain Thompson knew exactly what to do. He would have to run his ship directly in the troughs of the waves to even enter the Ludington Piers. He thought to himself that he could bring her safely into the harbor as he had done many, many times before this prior. However, this time, despite his experience and intimate knowledge of the lakes and the area, a miscalculation occurred, and what followed is quite tragic. The Pere Marquette 16 did safely reach her destination. However, before she could be tied to the pier, waves snatched her from Captain George L. Thompson's control and grasp. The waves were so violent that they tossed the pier Marquette around like a leaf in the wind. As she drew closer to the south pier, she actually slammed into the bottom of the lake with horrific force. This devastating collision threw the sleeping crewmen from their bunks and brought every single crewman to the deck to see what just happened. After the initial collision, steam pipes actually broke and the ship immediately lost light and power and heat. And then the pier Marquette began to drift against the north pier. Massive clouds of steam which were escaping from within the ship began to freeze all over the pier Marquette. As the officers began to count, they discovered that 3 men were missing. The first was a coal passer, Michael Taft of Chicago. He either had been pinned by debris or pipes or possibly knocked unconscious within the holds of the pier Marquette, but his fate was quite devastating. Steam had apparently overcome him and scalded him to death. This left his wife widowed and 2 children to mourn him. Later, as Michael's body was brought out of the pier Marquette, rescuers discovered that his body was, and I quote, literally cooked. Michael Taft had belonged to the Buffalo branch of the Firemen's Union and had shipped on the pier Marquette 16 just 3 days before this. After Michael Taft, the 2 other men that were missing were also coal passers, and they were found. This led me to believe that the accident occurred, possibly in the engine room somewhere. These 2 other men were also severely burnt, and they were unconscious and could not give their names. However, somehow they had managed to escape from within the pier Marquette and were taken to the Marine Hospital in Ludington, where they were given very little prospects of surviving or recovering after this collision and accident from the steam. Apparently, with how much steam was leaking from the pier Marquette 16, it also caught some other crew members off guard and also scalded them as well, however not near as bad as the other 3 coal passers. On Sunday morning, the stranded pier Marquette 16 was laying just 70 feet north of the North Pier, and waves were smashing her against it. This began to tear open several huge holes in her forward quarter. The pier Marquette 16 began to develop a heavy list to the starboard side, and a big lump about midships. However, this is where the Ludington life-saving crews came into action. There began to grow rescuers and hundreds of interested spectators across the shore and on the pier. The rescuers had to decide how to get the men from within the capsized ship. The rescue crews promptly brought out their Lyle gun and breeches buoy. They then successfully fired a shot line from their cannon on shore across the deck of the pier Marquette. They then secured one end of the cable firmly to the pier. Those that were on board the pier Marquette 16 made the line fast and hauled out the cable. With the lifesavers on shore and the crew members on the ship, they made sure that the line was fastened. There was also moving ice which completely surrounded the pier Marquette 16, and since she had no steam, it was bitter cold to even be on board of her. One by one, the lifesavers hauled 33 men and 1 corpse from the pier Marquette 16 and landed them safely on the pier. Captain Thompson was the last man to leave the pier Marquette 16. As he turned around and took one last look at his crippled ship, he broke down and began to weep. Just a mere day after the accident, tugs and pumps which were brought in from Milwaukee, Manistee, and Bay City began to try and raise the pier Marquette 16. However, as they began their attempt at raising her, the waves grew violent from the southwest, and the terrible cold also prevented any work from being done that day. The pier Marquette 16 rested on the sandy bottom in a bank of ice on the shoreside. This with the seas washing over her on the decks of the west side of the vessel. The entire ship was encased with ice, and no smoke was blowing from her stacks, as well as no crew to bring her in safely. However, after the passing of another day, the pure Marquette was finally rescued. The tugs and pumpers that the railroad had hired successfully freed her from the bar, and she resumed her voyages after being raised on Lake Michigan. After this incident, the pure Marquette 16 in 1907 was bought by the Hammermill Paper Company. They then cut her down to a barge, and this is again where she received her final name and final tasks of transporting pulpwood across the Great Lakes. On May 3, 1922, the freighter C.W. Jacob was towing the SS Harriet B and another barge, the Crete. All three of these vessels were loaded with pulpwood. The vessels arrived near Two Harbors, Minnesota at around 1 a.m. However, there was some heavy fog. The Jacob's captain decided to wait for the fog to lift. This was before heading into the harbor. The three vessels anchored just a mile offshore, and 3 miles southwest of Breakwater Light. However, the steel-hulled freighter Quincy A. Shaw was moving quickly up the lake. At around 4:50 a.m., the Shaw's bow appeared out of nowhere from the fog. She then crashed into the port side of the SS Harriet B. The Harriet was nearly cut in two, and just moments after the collision, the crew of the Harriet B began to frantically board the Shaw. After her collision, the Harriet B sank within 20 minutes after this. Her wheelhouse then broke off and washed ashore nearby. The SS Harriet B was actually accidentally discovered in 2005 by the University of Minnesota, Duluth. This was on a research boat, the Blue Heron. They were out conducting a geological survey of the lake bottom when they came across the Harriet B. The crew of the Blue Heron contacted Jerry Elizen and Randy Beebe, who then used drop cameras and side-scan sonar to confirm the identity of the Harriet B. The vessel rests upright and is almost completely intact in about 656 feet of water, just 4 miles off of Two Harbors, Minnesota. However, because of the extreme depth of the wreck, diving is really not advised. Jerry Elizen said that even a brief visit to the wreck would almost require at least 8 hours of decompression stops on the way back to the surface to complete the dive safely. The wreck of the Harriet B is believed to be the most intact shipwreck in Minnesota waters. And with that, we come to the end of the story of the Shenango No. 2, or the Muskegon, or the pure Marquette 16, or her final name, the SS Harriet B. We'll just stick with that. But wow, what a crazy, tragic turn of events for that day, for the captain to try and dock his ship in the piers there in Ludington, and for the waves to be so violent and to smash her against it like that, and that must have just shook everybody to their core when that collision happened. And that poor man, Michael Taft, I believe his name was. They must have been, him and the two other coal passers must have been down in the engine room, I can only assume, at the moment when it happened. And he must have been, Michael Taft must have been pinned, or, what could have happened. Maybe they couldn't get out of the, after the collision shock, they couldn't get out of the compartments down there, but that steam must have been pouring out of there at such a high rate, and he was scalded to death. What a horrible, tragic way to go. And then the two other men who were severely hurt as well by the steam. Just unreal, unbelievable. My heart goes out to him and his family and friends of this terrible incident that happened for them. But yeah, and then she ended up being a barge and transporting pulpwood to only be struck and then nearly cut in half, and her ending was to sink to the bottom like that. What a wild story for this vessel, but an incredible story, and one that I'm very glad that I can tell for you guys and get it out there. I'm sure there's a plethora of more information available on her, But tell me what you guys think down in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one and this story in particular. And yeah, again, my heart goes out to that man who did not make it. And I'm sure, I don't know if the other two coal passers possibly died from their injuries from the steam scalding. I'm not sure. It very well could have happened, but my heart goes out to them. And the captain wept, when he turned around and saw his vessel in the state that she was. Just a horrible incident. My gosh. But with that, guys, I thank you so very much for joining me on this episode. Again, let me know what you guys think down below. Share any information that I may have missed, or spelling or grammar errors. I always enjoy those. I need them. And yeah, look forward to the next video when it comes out, guys. So until then, thank you for joining me on Songs of the Great Lakes. And until next time, God bless you all.